Welcome to Learn at Work, a webinar series presented by the journal Work, a journal of prevention, assessment, and rehabilitation. I'm Dr. Karen Jacobs, the founding editor of the journal, and I'm delighted to be the moderator of today's webinar. I'm going to turn it over to our speaker, Jessica, whose article was published in Work. Jessica, take it over.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jacobs. It's a pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate the opportunity both to share our research through the journal Work and also to participate in this webinar. So I'm going to advance my slides. Let's see if that does it. Great. So the paper that I'm going to talk about today is the titles here, Prevalence of Serious Psychological Distress Among Slaughterhouse Workers at a U.S. Beef Packing Plant. As Dr. Jacobs said, my name is Jessica Liebler. I'm an assistant professor at the Boston University School of Public Health. I'm in the Department of Environmental Health, and I'm an environmental epidemiologist, and my research is at this intersection of occupational health and infectious disease epidemiology. I'm primarily focused on pathogens that people are exposed to in the context of their work life. And in that particular domain, much of my research has to do with food animal workers. So people who work on farms, on industrial farms, raising industrial chickens, pigs, cattle, for example, and then also people who work in slaughterhouses at a little bit of a later stage in the production cycle of meat in the United States. I also research injury among particularly slaughterhouse workers, and this paper that I'm going to talk about today is a new area of interest for me and for some of my colleagues, kind of focusing on the mental health consequences or risk factors, different sorts of variables involved with working at slaughterhouses. So I've listed here the link to my profile at Boston University, and feel free, if this is an area of interest to you or if you are interested in general to talk about any of these topics, I'd be more than happy to discuss further. I was going to write "good to meet you" in quotes, but I felt that was a little too clever, so good to see you virtually. I wanted to introduce up front my collaborators and co-authors on this study that I'm going to talk about. Dr. Melissa Perry is a professor, and she's the Interim Associate Dean for Research at the Milken Institute School of Public Health in George Washington University. And Dr. Perry is a leading environmental epidemiologist with specific interests in agricultural populations, worker populations. Much of her research has to do with reproductive health and pesticide and other chemical exposures among farm workers. But Dr. Perry also led a large R01 funded by NIOSH looking at laceration injury among slaughterhouse workers. So I put the link right there to Dr. Perry's research, which I encourage you also to check out. It's very interesting. Our other collaborator is Dr. Patricia Janowitz. Dr. Janowitz is a colleague of mine in the Department of Environmental Health at the BU School of Public Health. And Dr. Janowitz is a neurotoxicologist, and her research is primarily focused on neurological outcomes and mental health, much involving occupational health and specific occupational populations. And so we were excited to work together with Dr. Janowitz, specifically as we looked at the K6 and this measure of mental health and mental stressors that I'll talk about as we go a little bit further into the talk. So I'm deeply indebted to my two collaborators on this project, who were really fantastic to work with. So the outline for my talk over the next 30-40 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about some of the motivating questions and hypotheses that were kind of fueling our interest in this topic, and then I'm going to step back a little bit and talk about the beef packing industry, the animal slaughter industry in the United States, some of the big trends, who is the workforce, what are the work processes that we're talking about, what are the main health and safety concerns that we have in this population. I'll then narrow down a little more, focus on our small study, the Nebraska Beef Packer Study, which was a small study. It was a pilot study in its inception, intended to focus our our future research in particular areas and to test a few different hypotheses. I'll talk about the design, the methodologies that we use, and the findings as they relate to this particular study about psychological distress. And then we'll step back again and say, what does this mean? What are the implications of this study? And I'm happy to answer any questions, either now, kind of in real time, or later. If you're watching this at a later date and you have a question, feel free to send it to me via email or give me a call. So just in framing the issue, meatpacking work is one of those, in my mind, meatpacking is one of those occupations where it is very far outside of the experience of most people in the United States. As a culture in the US, we are fairly distant from the processes that produce the meat that we eat. We eat a lot of meat, but there are relatively few of us who are involved in the production through the agricultural process of the meat that we eat, and we tend to kind of structure the meat that we eat, even visually, in a way where it's hard to tell that it was once an animal. For example, you could see a hamburger or a chicken sandwich or chicken nuggets, for example, and you wouldn't in your mind click to, this is a cow, this is a chicken, where in other cultures around the world, the experience of eating meat is much more closely linked to the visual nature of that animal, just as an interesting aside. And so anyway, in my experience, the experience of meat packing is very different than other jobs and very distant for many Americans. So meat packing work, as you might expect, it's working in slaughterhouses. It's demanding, it's strenuous, high rates of occupational injury. I'll talk about that a little bit further. Also high rates of illness, which I don't specifically go into in this talk, but is the topic of a large bulk of my research. And there is very high turnover. The work environment is often uncomfortably hot, especially in the upstream components of production, the kill side or the hot side, and then can be uncomfortably cold in the sections of production where people are involved with cutting the animal hides and butchering the animal into smaller pieces to be packaged. The work environment is very fast-paced. These workers are largely working with fastly paced conveyor belts that increasingly the speed throughout time has increased, which puts increasing stress on the workers to do their jobs faster and faster, resulting in different sorts of injury and ergonomic strain. They have long hours, and the work can be very physically challenging, as I noticed. As I mentioned before, some workers are engaged in the kill, as I said, others on the butchering. We'll talk more about that. And interestingly, this particular paper that I'm going to talk about today emerged from my experience in interviewing these workers about other topics. And I was very interested that in talking to people and asking them to talk about their job and what they do on a daily basis, they report high levels of stress. They report high levels of family distress, high levels of interpersonal conflict, just socially kind of stress within their individual lives and within their families that led me to consider mental health concerns in this particular study. So here were some of the motivating questions that we were thinking about as we were getting going on this research. So first of all, does slaughterhouse work exact a psychological toll on workers? I think for someone who this comes from the experience of a number of us researchers going into this work environment, and I have spent a good deal of time in slaughterhouse work environments, and they are stressful. There are animals that are being killed every second, every few seconds, depending on the type of animal and the type of facility. And for people who are not familiar with this sort of mechanized death process, I don't know if there's another way to describe it, you would think that it can be very stressful. And so I was wondering if it exerted that same sort of psychological toll on workers that it would maybe as an outsider. Delving a little deeper into that question, since there are distinct work processes within a slaughterhouse, I was wondering if workers who work closer to the kill, who are more involved with the direct kill of the animal, do they experience more distress than workers who are involved in butchering, which is further down the line and where you're not daily or by moment kind of experiencing that that death of the animal experience. On the flip side, there's another motivating question that kind of comes from the other angle, where the first two bullet points would suggest that slaughterhouse workers might express greater psychological distress because of the nature of the work, or there might be particular job functions in the plant that might be more associated with high stress compared to others. This last bullet point posits potentially workers who are involved in animal slaughter might be more robust to the sorts of psychological distress that those of us who don't work in this industry experience when we walk into a slaughterhouse. Compared to the, compared to the general public, something in epidemiology we call the healthy worker effect. That maybe these people who work in slaughterhouse, and so I had said there's very high turnover, so maybe the people who persist in these jobs are just more robust to working in a stressful work environment. So maybe we would see lower prevalence of psychological distress in this population. So these were just some of the interesting questions we had at the outset of this research. Slaughter and packing, just to describe the industry in the United States a little bit, there's, just for some most recent data, about 50 billion pounds of red meat produced in the United States. Almost 100% of the red meat in the United States are produced in these large commercial industrial style plants. However, there are fewer and fewer slaughterhouses as time goes on. This is an industry that has rapidly consolidated in the last beef in the last maybe 20 years, where now there are about 800 federally inspected slaughter plants in the United States, and production, about half of production in the United States takes place in Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, and Texas. Beef cattle is the largest single component of U.S. agriculture, representing 35% of all farms in the United States, and cows are big. They can weigh more than 1,000 pounds. So when you think of working in a slaughterhouse, these are very, very large animals that are being disassembled in this work process. The demographics of the slaughterhouse workforce: there's approximately 80,000 slaughterhouse workers in the United States. These are low-paid jobs. These are minimum wage jobs. The mean annual salary is about $25,000 per year. Unlike other components of the agricultural workforce, there actually are a lot of women involved in slaughterhouse work, especially on the butchering side of slaughter work, a little less than 40% of the workforce. It's a diverse work environment where 20% are Black, African American, 10% Asian, 30 some odd percent are Latino. That number has gone up a bit in the last 5 years or so. One of the interesting demographic shifts in the slaughterhouse workforce, is that over the last 10 to 12 years, the industry has shifted from being primarily white American to primarily immigrant from Central America. And so right now, approximately 40% of the workforce in these large industrial slaughterhouses, which make up the majority of the industry in this field, are immigrants. Most immigrants in the slaughterhouse workforce are documented, meaning that they hold legal immigration status, which is different from a lot of workers in other sectors, especially farm labor in the agricultural sector. Some are not documented, but most are. And most workers, not most, but many workers in the slaughterhouse workforce are unionized. And the union is specifically targeting, in this case, the documented workers, many of whom are being recruited actively by the industrial meat-producing conglomerates from Central America to come work in these plants in Iowa, Nebraska, Texas, for example. And so in this study that we conducted, this small study in Nebraska, the vast majority of the workers that we met were immigrants from El Salvador that have been recruited specifically by the corporate entity. And there's very high turnover, just my last bullet point here, more than 80% in 1 year. And to kind of pull that out a little bit, most of those who leave the industry do so within the first 3 months of employment, speaking again to the strenuousness and the very physically challenging nature and emotionally challenging nature potentially of this work. Here's employment of slaughterers and meat packers by state, going back to, this is from the USDA Census of Agriculture in 2013, and it again is just showing the distribution of where these workers are located around, around the United States. To talk a little bit about occupational injury, just to give you some background, for some recent statistics, animal slaughter, as these injury statistics are separated by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, animal slaughter, including cattle and pork, and poultry processing are two separate categories of data. So if we look at animal slaughter, cattle and pork, which our workers would be a component of, there's 8.7 cases per 100 workers. Poultry processing, it's a little bit lower, 4.9 cases per 100 workers. And just for reference, these are some of the industries that have among the highest rates of occupational injury in the United States. And I wanted to just give you both some very high injury references like police work, iron and steel forging, working in a correctional institution, for example, working in an underground mine, and then across the top row, the rate of injury across all manufacturing, so kind of all different sorts of industry. And you can see that animal slaughter is a little bit more than twice that for all manufacturing, lower than police and iron work, but around the same level as working in a correctional institution, just so you have a reference of what what those rates mean for injury. I wanted to show a little bit too about the workflow in a meat packing facility for those listening who are not as familiar with this industry. Basically animals enter these facilities alive, and they are brought into pens. Sometimes the pens are inside, sometimes the pens are outside. They are trucked in from the industrial animal raising facility, and then they are held there, usually for no more than 4 hours. They are, depending on the type of animal, they are stunned, they are bled. There's different techniques. Some poultry are kind of gassed, depending on the type of animal. So they're held there in living. They are brought into an area where the animal is killed. The animals are then hung on a production line. They are eviscerated. They're kind of split down the middle. They are disinfected. Animal disinfection takes on important functions in an industrial slaughterhouse, with care made not to puncture the animal's intestines, although sometimes that's not always successful. After the animal is hung on the line and kind of opened up and cleaned out, it is chilled for 24 hours, also to try to kill remnant bacteria. And then the cold side of production comes in. So the cutting of the animal into chops, into different sorts of tenders, or however they're cutting up the meat, and then it's packed and shipped. And typically this whole process occurs in one facility, and there are different people working in each component of the workflow. So you have workers who are working in delivery and holding. You have workers who are working on studying, bleeding, and the kill. You have workers who are hanging the animals on the line and splitting and involving with disinfection. You have animals, they call it in the locker, the cooler, who are working in that chilling facility. And then you have a lot of workers who are on the cutting or the kind of butchering, the cold side. Other workers who are in packing and shipment. And so, as I said, in the parlance of slaughterhouse work, there's two different sides. They call it dirty and clean. I put clean in quotation marks because it depends on your definition of clean. But the hot side are these early stages of production before the animal is chilled and then cut. So that's the hot side. And then the cold side are these later elements of shipment. And these come into our hypotheses. Our research hypotheses, as I mentioned earlier, was that the workers on the hot side might have higher levels of distress compared to workers on the cold side, those workers who are closer to the kill. So some jobs on the hot side, as I mentioned before, workers on the hot side are involved in animal transport and monitoring the carbon dioxide chamber if the animals are being gassed as their mechanism of being killed, shackling the animals, kind of hanging them by their hooves upside down to put them on the production line so that they can be basically cut apart as they're kind of moving through the facility. All of these different sorts of things, bleeding, splitting, dehairing, that are involved in the functions on the hot side in the industrial slaughter facility. Most of these workers are men. It is demanding physical work. It is physically hot. The animals are big, and they are often the workers who are the lowest socioeconomic, the group with the lowest socioeconomic status in the worker community. Also, workers who are generally newest to the facility are put in those jobs on the hot side. They use these large handheld saws, which can be quite dangerous. These jobs have very, very high turnover, and the employers often will rotate men out of these jobs after the first few months, so that they can kind of, as not like a hazing, but kind of give them the tough job early on. If they can do it, they will move them out of those jobs into a job that is more preferred. Some occupational risks associated with working on the hot side: kicks from live animals who are typically quite stressed, being hit by hanging carcasses, slips, trips, and falls are big ones. Laceration injuries are very important for worker safety throughout the slaughterhouse facility. There are lots of knives and sharps in these facilities. Oftentimes the workers have them in their belts, and they might have knife sharpeners in their belts too, and they are working on a very quickly moving production line. So lacerations, hearing loss, it can be noisy, exposure to pathogens through different media, respiratory irritation, and a mental health risk, the topic we were going to focus on here. Okay, and just again by background, some other occupational risks involved on the cold side of industrial animal production. We're primarily looking at lacerations, repetitive stress injury, hearing loss, and pathogen exposure. So just to give you some introduction now to the study that we conducted in Nebraska and reported on for this talk. The Nebraska beef packer study, the larger scale study, the parent study, was focused on pathogen transmission from cattle to workers. We were specifically looking at MRSA, which is methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, a type of highly drug-resistant staph that has been found in many other sorts of animals and among farm worker and some slaughter populations, and we were interested to see if there was transmission from cattle to workers in the context of a cattle slaughterhouse. We then, after we looked at that primary study on MRSA transmission, it was a pilot grant to myself and Dr. Perry. And we then turned to a secondary analysis on occupational injury and mental health in this population. These are two prior papers that came out about this study, and if you're interested, please do take a look at them, and I'm happy to send them to you as well. The first about Staph aureus, and the second about occupational injury. The study design was cross-sectional. We were working at an industrial slaughterhouse facility with about 2,000 workers that's owned by a large international corporation that we agreed not to name in the context of our research. We conducted in-person interviews that took 20 to 30 minutes. We had questionnaires that were semi-structured questionnaires to get at job task, duration of employment, demographics, and various other risk factors. We took a nasal swab as a component of our study of MRSA, and the study was organized in conjunction with the UFCW union, which is the United Food and Commercial Workers Union that represented the slaughterhouse workers, and they were very interested specifically in the drug-resistant bacterial research question. It was a convenient sampling design, which meant that our workers were volunteers, and we advertised in and around the plants and asked them to come to the union hall during a 4-day recruitment period, and they were eligible if they spoke English or Spanish. We had interviewers fluent in English and Spanish, older than 18 years, and had not traveled outside of the country in the last 3 months, and that was specific for our interest in MRSA. And all protocols were approved by the IRB at George Washington University, where both I and Dr. Perry were working at the time. The measure of psychological distress that we embedded into our questionnaire was called the Kessler-6, and some of you are probably more familiar with this metric than I am, or than I was leading into this study, those of you who work in the mental health research area. But it is a short metric used to assess serious psychological distress, which we'll call SPD. It's very short, as I said, and it's highly validated. There are thousands of papers that focus on use the Kessler-6 and focus on it as a as an outcome measure. And it's a tool that measures non-specific psychological distress. So it's not diagnostic for particular outcomes, but predictive of a series of anxiety, personality disorders, and depressive disorders in particular. It is used widely, as I said, and it's also specifically used in a number of national surveillance studies, specifically the CDC Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System, the BRFSS, where it was used in 2007 and 2009 to assess serious psychological distress across the population. Here's more on the K6. If you're interested, here's a reference in terms of another nationally representative study, the National Morbidity Study, where the K6 was used. Please, here's just an example where you can check out more on that. Here were the questions for the K6. Just these 6 questions framed around the past 4 weeks. So during the past 4 weeks, how much of the time did you feel so sad, nothing could cheer you up, nervous, restless or fidgety, hopeless, that everything was an effort, or worthless? And then participants were asked all the time, most of the time, some of the time, a little of the time, or none of the time. The K6 responses were coded in a way that has been also validated with this extensive literature on the K6, and we used a consistent method where basically someone who responded none of the time for a given category got a 0, and then if you said all of the time, you got a 4, and then the overall scores ranged from 0 to 24. They were aggregated across each particular question. The results were evaluated dichotomously and also categorically. The dichotomous cutoff we used was greater than or equal to 13 as a metric. If you had a score greater than or equal to 13, that constituted serious psychological distress. Lower than 13, we said you did not have serious psychological distress. We also looked categorically at the variable, as some other papers have done, where we used a range of 0 to 7, 8 to 12, and then greater than or equal to 13 to represent no distress, mild or moderate distress, severe distress. And we looked kind of at the data in both of these configurations. Statistical analysis, we did a few different things. We primarily looked at prevalence of serious psychological distress across demographic and occupational groups. And then we used exact logistic regression, which is a technique used to do logistic regression basically in very small samples, used to identify a limited number of risk factors, adjusting for the age brackets consistent with the data and sex. And we compared the prevalence data to the BRFSS, that CDC nationally weighted data set from 2009, to say, looking at the rates that we have in this worker population, how similar or different are they from what we might see in a general population survey. So some of the results from our study, basic demographics. This was a small study. As I said, we've recruited 137 people during that 4-day recruitment period. More than 90% of the workers identified as Hispanic, and the remaining 10% were largely non-Hispanic white workers. We had almost 50% women. The mean age was 44 years, and more than half of our participants had worked in the plant for more than 5 years, and many of them had worked in the industry for 5 to 10 to 15 to 20 years. So we did have a large bulk of people who were not new to the industry, but had worked in this industry for quite some time. Here is a table from our paper laying out our prevalence data, just the point estimates of prevalence, prevalence of serious psychological distress among the workers in our study. And across all workers, we noted prevalence of 4.4% of serious psychological distress. 14.6% of people expressed mild or moderate psychological distress in that middle range category, and 81% of the workers demonstrated no psychological distress on the basis of this K6 metric. Just to take you a little bit through this table, you can see if we're in the serious psychological distress column and we move downward, we can see observationally that women experienced almost 3 times, maybe not quite 3 times, the prevalence of SPD compared to men. That was not statistically significantly different in our study because of our small sample size, but just something we note as we're chatting about it now. non-Hispanic white workers expressed much, much, much higher rates of SPD compared to the Hispanic workers. This was our primary statistically significant finding. From the univariate analysis, that the white workers in the plant, the non-Hispanic white workers, appeared to have greater serious psychological distress than the Hispanic workers. And we could talk a little bit as this talk goes on about why that might be the case. We didn't see a tremendous pattern looking at the age range, but there does seem to be a little bit of an increase as the workers, that those older workers over 65 do seem to have quite a bit more serious psychological distress than some of the younger categories of workers, but we didn't have many in that category, so it's hard to, there was not a whole lot to interpret there in the small sample size. And it did appear observationally that the workers who worked in the kill floor and that hot production side did have higher serious psychological distress than those who worked on the cut floor, which was the cold side. But again, this was not statistically significant in the context of our study. So just in comparing the results of our Nebraska study to the behavioral risk factor surveillance system data from CDC, the US general population SPD prevalence is 3.6%. And so that leaves us with the indication that our findings here are mildly elevated with our point prevalence estimate of 4.4% compared to these general population estimates. As I said, it's a small study, and so we can't conclude with a huge level of certainty, but they do seem to be elevated. In the univariate models, the univariate exact logistic regression models that I mentioned, non-Hispanic white ethnicity was associated, as I said, with elevated risk of mild and moderate, but the effect was diminished when we adjusted for age and sex in adjusted models, and we were not able to identify statistically significant occupational risk factors for SPD. So we did not see a distinction between workers who were on the hot side and the cold side as it related to this outcome of serious psychological distress. Some of the conclusions that we drew from this was that the prevalence of SPD among these workers appeared to be higher than national estimates, although we cannot necessarily link this just to their work experience alone. As I said, many of these workers are immigrants. They are Spanish-only speakers. They're living in a very different community from the ones in El Salvador where they emigrated from. But they do seem to be higher, and so in our view, justified and focusing more on mental health in this workforce in future research. We certainly did not observe a healthy worker effect in regard to SPD, which led us to believe that it wasn't so much that the workers who hung around in this industry were just robust to the experience of working in this workforce. That was not something that came through in our data. We did not identify statistically significant occupational risk factors, including working near the kill, although there were indications in looking at the data that that is an area that should be followed up with larger studies, and that we did certainly see trends in that direction. Our one statistically significant finding was that the white workers in the plant did express greater prevalence of psychological distress, and we hypothesized that that might be due to their minority status in the plant. There are very few white workers in the plant, and that has been a shift. Many of the white workers in the plant had been there for 10 to 15 years or more, and perhaps that demographic shift has led to an experience of stress. We also thought that we might have tapped into ethnic differences in reporting mental health status, which has been demonstrated in the literature in other ways, and that by cultural group or ethnic group, people may be more willing to express to an interviewer, for example, that they are experiencing some sort of psychological distress, where other cultures might put a preference on saying everything is fine. So this would be another interesting issue to kind of pursue further. Some of the limitations of this study, as I have said a few times, it was a small study with a small sample size. We had wide confidence intervals, and we really were not able to assess multiple predictors, and this is a consistent challenge anytime you do pilot research. that you have all of these issues, and so you take what you can from the data. The primary questioning from our interview tool focused on infectious disease risk because that was the central theme of the parent study. So it wasn't specifically focused on emotional experience or mental health, and we hope that later studies will be more geared towards these sorts of outcomes. We were recruiting workers from a single facility, and so the extension of our findings from this one workforce to from this one facility to the workforce at large should be done with caution. It's possible that workers in this plant were functionally different than workers in other plants, although we didn't have a reason to necessarily think that that was the case. There was a selection bias from volunteer participants, which maybe would lead towards a bias towards the null if you expect that workers who might be willing to come in and talk about their work experience might have a somewhat better experience than others. But as it relates to mental health outcomes, you could also equally say it could go in the other direction, bias away from the null, that participants who might come in because they have a worse occupational experience. The participants did not have any sense that this research was about mental health outcomes. We discussed it with them framed around the MRSA hypotheses. So it's unlikely that selection bias occurred one way or the other in regard to mental health outcomes here. We did not include workers who left the industry after fewer than 3 months of employment, which likely does lead to a bias towards the null, and that it's possible and highly likely that workers who quit after a short period of time did so because they found the job very stressful. So that would be an interesting subpopulation to look at further. The K6 is a limited tool. As you saw, it only has 6 questions. As much as it is highly validated, it is not going into people's experiences more deeply. And so one of our follow-ups would be to use a more refined outcome metric of mental health. Some of the strengths of this study were that we conducted in-person interviews, the majority in Spanish, of a difficult-to-reach workforce, and slaughterhouse workers can be very challenging to engage in research studies because many of them are very afraid of losing their job, and participating in studies is often something that the employers discourage. And they certainly did in this case, but the workers joined the study anyway. But this was a strength of the study that we were able to actually talk to these workers in person. The participants in the study kind of mirrored overall plant demographics and the job tasks, thanks to the recruiting work of our union partners, which led us to believe that we did have a representative sample of the workers in this particular plant, and we could extrapolate our findings to the workers in the plant as a whole. And the questionnaire tool was developed in close collaboration with the union to make sure that we didn't misclassify jobs, and we kind of were asking the right questions in the right parlance in a way that the workers could give us the best possible information. So some of the next steps as we look to transition from pilot work to larger scale work would obviously be a larger scale study on mental health among the meatpacking workforce to inform this occupational risk. We're interested, as I said, to use a more refined psychological tool and better questions to really get at more of that emotional experience of working in a slaughterhouse, and also to promote services and various interventions to support the mental health among this workforce, which is not an area that has been identified primarily as a challenge for occupational health and safety among slaughterhouse work, which is primarily focused on injury and a little bit less so on illness. So just to conclude, I acknowledge obviously the workers who participated in this study, who took time out of their day to come talk with us about their experience in the plant. It was really tremendous, and we are greatly appreciative. And the union as well, the United Food and Commercial Workers Union, the collaborators both at the plant in Nebraska and also in Washington, D.C. We are grateful to them. And just to conclude, there's my email address. Please feel free to be in touch if you have questions or you're interested in other aspects of this work. And I just linked 2 links to my other research on agricultural workers, food animal workers, and also to Dr. Perry's, so you can get a sense of the other research that we are doing on this population as well as other agricultural worker populations. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting. And this is, an area that I don't have um, any really experience other than, reading a journal article. It was really fascinating. So a couple of questions. You had some next steps, but let me make that next step a little bit more intriguing.
Sure.
Um, what would happen? And you're completely grant funded, is that correct, to do these studies?
For our next step studies?
Yes.
No, we're in the process of applying for grants now.
So maybe you could share what agencies are supporting your research, and let's play out this fantasy. Um, Maybe you don't have to apply for a grant and you have limited amount of money. What would your next steps be?
I think that's a fascinating question and always one that as academics we love to talk about these days. I think
I know.
most of our work on the slaughterhouse workers has been funded by NIOSH, which is the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, which is an institute of CDC. And they are the ones who have taken the deepest interest in looking at the work experience of this workforce. Some of the research I do on pathogens has been funded in conjunction by the NIH, National Institutes on Allergy and Infectious Disease, NIAID, NIAID, the types of research that are focused more on the genomic or virologic components of the kind of microbiology aspect of pathogen exposure. But NIOSH is really the primary funder of this research, and so they are certainly the institute that we target. I think NIOSH right now is certainly under funding constraint. As we look at the proposals for the federal budget as a CDC entity, while NIH seems to may have been spared, CDC seems to be less fortunate in that regard, and so NIOSH is likely going to be having some constrictions in the next few funding cycles as a result of that. And so they've also shifted around how their funding is oriented, and they have gotten rid of, they had an agricultural health subsection, which they have gotten rid of and kind of linked those topics in with other things. So there's some shifts now in the NIOSH funding structure that those of us who are engaged with NIOSH are trying to follow. In terms of um, having unlimited resources, I would certainly be interested. I mean, I feel like I'm interested in so many aspects of um, the experience of people who come from other countries to produce our meat in the United States. And it's not that different from the experience of immigrants across many different sorts of undesirable jobs where you have people who are interested to come to the United States, and they come to the United States and in conjunction with coming to this country are paid a small amount of money to do a job where it's increasingly difficult to find other people to work in those jobs. And this is a classic example of that. I am very interested in the linkage between occupational injury and mental health. And to the extent that this is a workforce that's highly injured, they're also a workforce where they tend to work while they're injured, and they don't want to step off the line. They don't want to take a day off because they're afraid of losing their jobs. So they tend to work while they're injured, which often tends to make the injury worse or kind of complicate the healing of the injury, and leading to, I think, stress, or it seems like it would lead to stress. And I'm interested to see kind of what also that extension does for the family dynamic. So you have often people who, where there's husband and wife, and they're both working in the plant, and then their kids are attending the local school, and the parents are exposed to high rates of injury, a good deal of stress on the job, and they're also new immigrants, and they live in kind of almost entirely Spanish-speaking enclaves, and kind of what that experience is like for the children and the family is something I'm interested in as well. So I think if I had unlimited funding, I would certainly be interested to look at the link between injury and the mental health components, both for these workers and also for their families. Because this is all part of how our food is produced, and it's a hidden it's kind of a hidden component of what goes into our chicken nuggets and our chicken tenders, and it's an invisible workforce, yet it's a workforce that we interact with every meal as Americans. We are touching the product, the work product of this occupational group, and they are almost entirely invisible to us.
Well, you bring it back to, everyday life when you talk about, our chicken nuggets or any other place that we might be um, eating this food and not at all being aware. Thank you for playing out that fantasy. And we know that it's going to be challenging now with future funding, but I feel optimistic for you
Thank you.
and your
I hope so.
colleagues. So another question I have. Um, you mentioned your colleague that you're working with, and I think some others. Have you worked at all with other colleagues, like occupational therapists or physical therapists, any of the health and rehabilitation science professionals?
I have not, and I see from your background that this is something we should certainly talk about. I have not. I think most of my colleagues in this work, I come from public health training, and my colleagues are primarily environmental health people, occupational health. We're in the epidemiology world, so kind of environmental health epidemiologists, occupational health epidemiologists, people who are infectious disease specialists, and then people who are involved with microbiology and microbial epidemiology and looking at genomics and different sorts of gene related epidemiology. So no, I myself have not have not collaborated with colleagues outside of these spaces, and I think it would be really interesting to do so, specifically as it relates to mental health outcomes.
Yeah, I think that would be great. And I was thinking about, even at Boston University, we have so many people who would be interested in this area over at Sargent College.
Mhm.
So we'll do that offline, talking about other professions that might be able to join in and collaborate with you.
Great, I appreciate that a lot. And as I said in the beginning, this is really, for me personally, one of my first forays into mental health research. And so it opens up the opportunity to kind of engage with all different sorts of people over a new topic area and have it be different from the infectious disease work I've done previously. So it's very exciting.
No, that's great, and this is exciting for me. We're very happy to have published your article and work. I'm very interested in the future of seeing more articles published in this area. And how did you end up with your career taking this turn in looking at the psychological? I think you mentioned some of this, but did you start out with that being an area of interest, or did something inform you? Was there sort of an itch that you had a scratch that was making you look in that direction of the psychological aspects?
Now, that's a great question. I think even before I became an academic, I was involved with agricultural workers and in different elements of the agricultural workforce. And one of the things, once I would actually get out into the field and talk to people and conduct interviews and chat with the union leaders, everyone talks about how stressful their lives are. People who work especially in slaughterhouses, but also farm workers. There's a lot of stress. There is a lot of, I remember in talking with some of the union leaders and a few of the workers as we were trying to set up the study in Nebraska, they were talking about how high the divorce rate is when people come in, and it's often married couples and they emigrate together from El Salvador, and then within a few years they say everyone seems to be divorced. Divorce rates are really high, and there's just a lot of social conflict. People experience a lot of isolation, and so I think it was in talking people who work in this industry, while I was coming in with these hypotheses about injury and infectious disease, they were relaying it back to me like, we're interested in that, but you should also know that this work takes an emotional toll on people. And so that was kind of where I was coming at with wanting to kind of dip my toes a little bit into this world of mental health research to see if it was something that we could get some preliminary data on to move forward with. So I think it was the experience came from talking to people who work in this industry.
Great, thank you. Any last comments, thoughts that you'd like to make before we conclude the webinar today?
No, I appreciate so much the opportunity to publish this paper in work in the journal, and really appreciate your interest in this research. And actually there is a prior paper on a similar topic that was also published in work a few years ago by Dr. Perry and one of my colleagues, Lena Lander, that was looking at depressive symptoms and whether depressive symptoms were associated with occupational injury among slaughterhouse workers. And so I think having published these two papers, I think the journal work is really, this is a really new research area. There's almost no research in this space. So you are leading the way in looking at mental health outcomes among this particular subsector of the agricultural workforce. And so we're appreciative, and I thank all of you who opt to listen and have made it this far, and I'm happy to discuss any of these research topics with anyone at a later time.
Jessica, thank you, and thank you for your compliment with the work journal. We really want to publish cutting-edge research, clinical practice, scoping, reviews, systematic reviews. We're very excited about publishing your article. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today. This webinar will be on the Learn at Work YouTube channel, so let your friends know about this and they can listen to it at their leisure. Jessica, thank you again.
Thank you so much.